Medieval dining, rewritten opening. The last morsel of bread disappeared 3 days ago. Margaret's stomach gnawed at itself as she stirred the watery pottage, praying the handful of barley would stretch until tomorrow's dawn. Outside her cottage, the harvest moon mocked her empty grain stores, a cruel reminder that winter's grip would soon test every soul in the village. This was reality for 9 out of 10 Europeans between 500 and 1,500 Citiro, though Hollywood would have you believe otherwise. Forget the lavish banquets of torch-lit castle halls, the succulent roasted meats and exotic spices flowing like rivers of wine. Those cinematic feasts belonged to the privileged few, the nobility who dined while peasants calculated whether their last sack of grain could carry them through to spring. For the overwhelming majority who worked the land, mealtime wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. Medieval peasants existed in a knife-edge dance with starvation. Their diet obeyed the merciless laws of necessity, seasonality, and feudal obligations. A single failed harvest could transform subsistence into a death sentence. Yet somehow, against these impossible odds, common folk developed extraordinary strategies for staying alive. Without refrigeration, without global food networks, without any understanding of nutritional science, they mastered the art of making something from nothing. Through ingenious preparation methods, careful preservation techniques, and an almost mystical knowledge of local resources, they squeezed 2,000 to 3,000 calories from whatever the earth grudgingly provided. Their meals would horrify modern palates, monotonous bread, and endless variations of pottage. That thick soup stew that formed the backbone of peasant nutrition. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days and the dying. But within this apparent simplicity lay a complex web of survival wisdom that kept entire populations alive through humanity's harshest centuries, appeared rarely on their tables except during celebrations or in small amounts, as flavoring vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally, and fresh fruit was a seasonal luxury. What these humble people ate tells us not just about their diet, but about their entire way of life, their relationship to the land, their social structures, their technological capabilities, and their worldview. The medieval peasant diet was not simply a matter of personal choice, but reflected complex systems of land tenure, agricultural practices, religious observances, and community obligations. As we explore the cheap meals that kept medieval people alive, we'll discover a cuisine born of necessity, but shaped by remarkable ingenuity, from the ubiquitous daily bread to foraged woodland delicacies, from humble pottage to carefully preserved winter stores. The medieval peasant diet represents one of humanity's most successful adaptations to environmental constraints and social inequality. These were not just meals, but survival strategies developed over centuries and passed down through generations. Culinary knowledge as essential to life as the air they breathed. Let us step into the smoky interior of a medieval cottage, where a cauldron bubbles over the hearth fire, and discover what truly fed the people who built the medieval world, the staff of life, bread and grains, daily bread, the foundation of medieval survival. If there was one food that defined medieval existence, it was bread. The centrality of bread in the medieval diet cannot be overstated. It was quite literally the staff of life. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements consistently reveals the remains of bread ovens, grain storage facilities, and milling equipment, testifying to bread's fundamental importance for the average peasant. Bread constituted between 70 to 80% of their daily caloric intake. Mana records from 13th century England indicate that a working adult male might consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread daily, an amount that seems staggering to modern sensibilities, but was necessary for those engaged in constant physical labor. This reliance on bread was so profound that wages were sometimes calculated in terms of bread loaves, and bread prices were strictly regulated to prevent social unrest. The bread consumed by medieval peasants bore little resemblance to the light white loaves found in modern supermarkets. Peasant bread was typically made from rye or masselen, a mixture of wheat and rye resulting in a dense dark loaf. The milling process was imperfect, leaving small bits of stone and other impurities in the flour. The coarseness of medieval flour had one unexpected benefit. It contains significantly more fiber and nutrients than modern refined flour, inadvertently providing essential minerals and vitamins. The process of bread making was labor-intensive and communal in many villages. Families prepared their dough at home, but brought it to the Lord's oven for baking, a service for which they paid a fee called banalities. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages like Warren Percy in Yorkshire reveals the remains of these communal ovens, which served as important social hubs in other communities. Particularly by the later Middle Ages, peasants might construct small clay or stone ovens adjacent to their homes. The bread itself was typically leavened with sourdough, a portion of fermented dough saved from the previous batch. This natural fermentation process not only raised the bread, but also increased its nutritional value by breaking down phytides that would otherwise block mineral absorption. Resulting loaves were flat and dense by modern standards, with a thick crust that helped preserve the interior bread quality. Followed strict social hierarchies according to the 14th century household account book, Les Mains de Paris. There were 3 distinct types of bread: handba bread, made from the finest white flour for the nobility, pandouche mouth bread of medium quality for merchants and craftsmen, and pain-buys or panoir brown or black bread made from coarse, minimally sifted rye or maslin flour for the peasantry. The darkness of peasant bread came not just from the use of rye, but from the inclusion of other grains and fillers when wheat and rye was scarce. Archaeological analysis of preserved bread fragments from medieval sites reveals the inclusion of barley, oats, peas, beans, acorns, and even ground bark during times of famine. A particularly revealing example comes from excavations at a 13th century peasant dwelling in the deserted medieval village of Hangleton, Sussex, where carbonized bread remains contain significant quantities of veach. And pea flour mixed with grain bread was not merely food, it carried profound cultural and religious significance. The Lord's Prayer's plea for daily bread reflected the real anxiety about securing this essential staple. Bread featured prominently in religious ceremonies, folk customs, and social obligations. To share bread was to share life itself, and the breaking of bread together formed bonds of community and obligation during times of scarcity, particularly after poor harvests or during the frequent famines that struck medieval Europe. Bread became even more precious. Historical records document desperate measures taken to stretch flour supplies. The chronicler Jean de Vannes described the bread eaten during the famine of 1315 to 1317 as containing not only bran with a little wheat flour, but the bark of trees and even dried and ground clay. While such accounts may contain elements of exaggeration, archaeobotanical evidence confirms that in times of dark medieval people incorporated unusual ingredients into their bread out of desperate necessity. Pottage, porridge, and grill and liquid bread. If bread was the foundation of the medieval peasant diet, various forms of grain-based porridges and grills were its essential complement. These dishes, known variously as pottage, porridge grill, or fumente, depending on their consistency and ingredients, provided a way to stretch limited grain supplies and create filling meals with minimal fuel. Pottage was essentially a thick soup or stew, usually grain-based, but containing whatever vegetables, herbs, or occasional morsels of meat were available. It was the medieval peasants. Daily one-pot meal simmered in the central hearth cauldron and consumed for multiple meals. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages consistently reveals the centrality of the cooking pot in peasant households. Excavations at the deserted medieval village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire uncovered numerous cooking pots positioned in the central hearths of peasant dwellings, many showing signs of repeated use and repair, testament to their essential role in daily survival. The most basic form of pottage was simple grill grain boiled in water, or if available, milk, until it formed a thin porridge-like consistency. This humble dish appears frequently in medieval accounts and literature as the food of the poorest members of society. The 14th century poem Piers Plowman describes the diet of the poor as bread and thin ale and a mess of pottage. More substantial versions of pottage incorporated a wider range of ingredients. A typical recipe might begin with a base of oats, barley, or rye, simmered slowly with dried peas or beans, and whatever vegetables were in season. Onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, or carrots, herbs gathered from the garden or woodland added flavor. Parsley, sage, garlic, and thyme were common additions. The resulting dish was thick enough to be eaten with a spoon or soaked up with bread. The composition of pottage varied dramatically with the seasons. Spring pottage might contain young nettles, sorrel, and other forage greens. Summer versions incorporated garden vegetables and fresh herbs. Autumn pottage featured root vegetables and dried legumes, while winter pottage relied heavily on stored grains, dried peas, and preserved vegetables. This seasonal variation provided not just culinary variety, but ensured a changing nutritional profile. Throughout the year, the cooking method itself was ingeniously efficient. The cauldron would hang over the fire on an adjustable chain or hook called a hanger or trammel, allowing the cook to raise or lower it to control the cooking temperature. The pottage would simmer slowly throughout the day, with family members dipping in for meals as needed each evening. Fresh ingredients might be added to replenish what had been consumed, creating a perpetual pot that could continue for days. This method maximized fuel efficiency, a crucial consideration when firewood was scarce or expensive. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating insights into these cooking practices. Analysis of residues from cooking pots found at the medieval village of West Cotton in Northamptonshire revealed traces of barley oats, wheat peas, and various leafy vegetables, confirming the mixed nature of these one-pot meals. Carbonized food remains from hearths at sites across Europe show similar patterns of grain and vegetable combinations. For special occasions or in slightly wealthier households, pottage might be enriched with more luxurious ingredients. Menti, a thicker porridge made from cracked wheat, boiled in milk, could be sweetened with honey for festivals or religious celebrations. Manor account books occasionally record small quantities of meat being added to pottage on feast days, or when animals were slaughtered, transforming the daily staple into something more festive. The nutritional importance of these grain-based dishes cannot be overstated. They provided complex carbohydrates for energy, some protein, particularly when legumes were included, in a vehicle for consuming vegetables and herbs that might otherwise be unpalatable. The long, slow cooking process made nutrients more available and helped neutralize some of the anti-nutritional factors present in medieval grains and legumes. Pottage was so fundamental to medieval peasant life that it became synonymous with basic sustenance. The English word pottage shares its root with pottage soup and pot, highlighting its connection to the cooking vessel itself. When the biblical figure Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage, Medieval listeners would have understood this not as an exotic dish, but as the most basic of meals, making his choice all the more shocking. Alternative grains, millet, barley, and oats, while wheat and rye dominated bread making. Other grains played crucial roles in the medieval peasant diet, particularly in regions where the climate or soil was unsuitable for wheat cultivation. These secondary grains, primarily barley, oats, and millet, were often more affordable and resilient, making them essential survival foods during difficult times. Barley was particularly important in northern and mountainous regions. Archaeological evidence from sites across medieval Scotland, Scandinavia, and alpine regions shows barley as the predominant grain, less demanding than wheat in terms of soil quality and growing conditions. Barley could thrive in areas with poor drainage, high altitude, or short growing seasons for peasants. In these regions, barley formed the foundation of their diet, while barley could be made into bread. Its low gluten content resulted in dense, flat loaves that were difficult to leaven. More commonly, barley was used to make pottage, flatbreads, or bananacs, a type of unleavened bread cooked on a griddle or bakestone. Archaeological excavations at medieval sites frequently uncover bakestones, flat stones, or clay plates placed over the fire used for cooking. These simple flatbreads at the deserted medieval village of Hundor on Dartmoor, several such bakestones were discovered in peasant dwellings, indicating the importance of this cooking method. Barley had another crucial use in medieval peasant life: beer production, even for the poorest households. Some portion of the barley harvest would be malted and brewed into ale. This practice was not merely for enjoyment. Ale provided essential calories, nutrients, and perhaps most importantly, safe hydration. When water sources might be contaminated, manor records from 14th century England suggest that a typical adult might consume a gallon or more of weak ale. Daily, the brewing process, usually carried out by women known as alewives, created a mildly alcoholic beverage that was safer than water and provided B vitamins and calories. Oats thrived in the cool, damp conditions of northern Europe, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia. For peasants in these regions, oats were often the primary grain. The 16th century Scottish historian Hector Bowes noted that the common people of Scotland lived primarily on cakes of oats and pottage of oats, with a little mixture of peas or beans. Archaeological evidence supports this account. Excavations at medieval Scottish sites consistently reveal large quantities of oat remains and specialized equipment for processing. Oats, unlike barley and wheat, oats were rarely made into bread. Instead, they were typically consumed as porridge or baked into oat cakes. The simplest preparation was a basic porridge made by boiling oats in water or milk, a dish that remains part of Scottish culinary tradition today. Oat cakes were made by forming a dough of oatmeal, water, and salt, then cooking it on a bakestone. These flat, circular cakes could be stored for days and carried as portable food for workers in the fields. Millet was particularly important in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as in regions with poor soil where other grains struggled to grow, less familiar to modern Western diets. Millet was a critical survival food for medieval peasants. In these areas, archaeological evidence from medieval sites in Poland, Hungary, and parts of France and Italy show significant millet consumption. Among the lower classes, millet had several advantages for peasant farmers. It matured quickly in as little as 60 to 90 days, required minimal water, and could grow in poor soils. It could be planted later than other grains, providing a safeguard against the failure of winter crops. Millet was typically prepared as a porridge or formed into flat cakes. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was fermented to produce a mildly alcoholic beverage, similar to kvass. These alternative grains were often viewed with disdain by the upper classes, who preferred the whiter bread made from wheat. This social distinction is reflected in medieval literature and records. The 12th century writer Alexander Neckham noted that barley bread, is horse fodder, but men eat it when compelled by famine. Despite such prejudices, these inferior grains were nutritional powerhouses, often containing more protein, fiber, and micronutrients than the refined wheat flour consumed by the wealthy during times of famine or crop failure. Knowledge of how to prepare these alternative grains could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Medieval agricultural manuals and household guides often included instructions for making the most of these grains. The 14th century Tuscan writer Petro de Crescenzi advised that in times of scarcity, millet could be mixed with small amounts of wheat to make acceptable bread, noting that it nourishes little but fills the belly. The archaeological record reveals fascinating adaptations in grain consumption during periods of hardship. Analysis of plant remains from cesspits, medieval toilets, at sites dating to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 shows a marked increase in the consumption of oats and barley, even in regions where wheat was typically preferred. This evidence of dietary flexibility demonstrates how peasants adapted to changing circumstances to ensure survival. Vegetables and legumes. The garden's bounty root. Vegetables, turnips, carrots, and parsnips, root vegetables, form the backbone of the medieval peasants' plant-based nutrition. These humble underground crops, particularly turnips, carrots, and parsnips, were essential to survival for several critical reasons. They stored well through winter, yielded abundantly even in poor soil, and provided substantial calories and nutrients. When grain supplies ran low, turnips deserved special recognition as perhaps the most important vegetable in the medieval peasant diet across much of northern Europe. Archaeological evidence from medieval rural settlements consistently reveals turnip seeds and pollen in significant quantities. These fast-growing root vegetables could be planted after the grain harvest, effectively giving peasants a second crop from the same land. A 13th century agricultural treatise by Walter of Henley recommends turnips as both human food and animal fodder, noting their ability to sustain the household through the lean months. The medieval turnip bore little resemblance to the small, uniform purple-topped varieties found in modern supermarkets. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests they were larger, more irregularly shaped, and often whiter in color. Their flavor was likely stronger and more bitter than modern cultivars, which have been bred for mildness. Turnips were typically prepared by boiling or roasting, often added to pottage, or sometimes mashed with other vegetables. During severe food shortages, turnips might be dried and ground into a coarse flour to extend limited grain supplies, a practice documented during the famines of the early 14th century. Carrots in medieval Europe were not the bright orange vegetables we know today. Archaeological seed remains and illuminated manuscripts depict purple, white, and yellow varieties. The familiar orange carrot was developed later in the Netherlands. During the 17th century, medieval carrots were typically thinner and woodier than modern varieties, with a more pronounced and sometimes bitter flavor. Despite these differences, they were valued for their storage potential and versatility. Parsnips, with their higher sugar content and caloric value, were particularly prized in northern regions where growing seasons were short, often sweeter. After exposure to frost, parsnips provided crucial winter nutrition when other foods were scarce. Archaeological evidence from medieval village sites in England, Germany, and Scandinavia shows that parsnips were widely cultivated, with their distinctive seeds found in many household middens, refuge heaps. The cultivation of these root crops followed careful seasonal patterns, typically planted in late spring or early summer. They would be harvested in late autumn. Before the ground froze, storage methods were ingeniously simple but effective. Root cellars, underground chambers, or pits maintained consistently cool temperatures and high humidity, ideal conditions for preserving root vegetables. Archaeological excavations at numerous medieval village sites have uncovered these storage facilities, sometimes with remarkable preservation of their contents. At the deserted medieval village of Wareham Percy in Yorkshire, archaeologists discovered a root cellar containing the remains of turnips and parsnips stored in layers of straw, a glimpse into the practical food preservation techniques of ordinary people. Another common storage method involved creating outdoor clamps, mounds of root vegetables covered with straw and soil that provided insulation against freezing. This technique, requiring no specialized structures, was particularly important for the poorest peasants who might lack proper storage facilities. Evidence for these clamps appears in the archaeological record as distinctive pit features near dwelling sites. The nutritional contribution of these root vegetables to the medieval diet was significant. While contemporary peasants wouldn't have understood the concept of vitamins, these vegetables provided crucial micronutrients, particularly vitamin C, that helped prevent deficiency diseases. During winter months, when fresh produce was unavailable, modern nutritional analysis of heritage vegetable varieties similar to medieval types suggests they may have contained higher concentrations of certain nutrients than their modern counterparts, partly offsetting their smaller size. Root vegetables also played a critical role in the annual hunger gap, the dangerous period in late spring when winter food stores were depleted, but new crops had not yet matured during these weeks or months. Stored roots might be the difference between subsistence and starvation. Historical records from memorial courts occasionally mention thefts of stored root vegetables during these periods, testament to their life-saving importance. The humble status of root vegetables is reflected in medieval literature and art, where they are frequently associated with peasant life. The 14th century poem Piers Plowman describes the poor subsisting on bread and penny ale and a mess of pottage and parsnips and turnips. Despite their low social status, these vegetables were the unsung heroes of medieval nutrition, providing crucial sustenance through the most difficult seasons: cabbage, kale, and leafy greens. If root vegetables anchored the winter diet of medieval peasants, the various members of the cabbage family provided essential nutrition throughout the growing season. Cabbage, kale, and related leafy greens were among the most widely cultivated vegetables in medieval gardens, valued for their hardiness, productivity, and versatility. Cabbage was particularly important, appearing consistently in archaeological and documentary evidence across medieval Europe. Unlike modern tight-headed varieties, medieval cabbage was typically looser and more leafy, closer to what we might now call spring greens or collards. This open-headed form had advantages for peasant gardeners. Leaves could be harvested continuously throughout the growing season without killing the plant, providing a steady supply of fresh greens. The significance of cabbage in the medieval peasant diet is reflected in place names and folklore. In many European languages, words for cabbage gardens gave rise to place names still existing today. The Germanic word coal cabbage appears in numerous village and field names across northern Europe. Cabbage featured prominently in folk traditions and superstitions. In many regions, cabbage leaves were used in folk medicine as pickuses for wounds and inflammations, while cabbage seeds planted on specific saints' days were believed to produce the best crops. Archaeological evidence for cabbage consumption comes primarily from the recovery of seeds and pollen from medieval sites, as the leaves themselves rarely survive. In the archaeological record, analysis of cesspit contents from medieval towns and villages consistently reveals cabbage seeds, confirming its dietary importance. At the medieval village of West Stow in Suffolk, archaeobotanical analysis identified significant quantities of Brassicas seeds, the genus, including cabbage, kale, and related plants in household waste deposits, suggesting these vegetables were staples rather than occasional foods. Kale, a close relative of cabbage, was particularly important in northern regions where its exceptional cold hardiness allowed it to provide fresh greens even through winter in milder areas. Medieval varieties of kale were typically taller and more robust than modern cultivars. Growing up to 6 feet in height with thick, sturdy stems, these plants could withstand frost and continue producing edible leaves when most other vegetables had succumbed to winter weather. The cultivation pattern for these leafy greens was carefully integrated into the peasant agricultural year. Cabbage seedlings were typically started in protected beds in early spring, then transplanted to garden plots. After the danger of severe frost had passed, this practice, documented in medieval agricultural manuals like Petro de Crescensis Ruralia Commota circa 1304 to 1309, maximized the growing season and protected vulnerable young plants. Preservation of cabbage and kale for winter use was accomplished through several methods. The simplest was to leave hardy varieties in the ground, harvesting leaves as needed throughout winter in regions where the climate permitted. In colder areas, preservation typically involved fermentation, the origin of sauerkraut, and similar fermented cabbage preparations. Archaeological evidence for this practice includes specialized pottery vessels with weights designed to keep cabbage submerged in its own brine during fermentation. Excavations at medieval sites in Germany, Poland, and parts of Scandinavia have uncovered these distinctive crocks, often with residue analysis confirming their use for cabbage fermentation. The nutritional importance of these vegetables in the medieval diet cannot be overstated. Rich in vitamin C, cabbage and kale helped prevent scurvy during winter months when fresh fruit was unavailable. Their high fiber content aided digestion of the coarse whole grain bread that formed the staple of peasant diets. Modern nutritional analysis suggests that heritage varieties of cabbage and kale contain significantly higher concentrations of certain nutrients than modern commercial varieties, indicating that medieval peasants may have received substantial nutritional benefits from these humble vegetables. Preparation methods for cabbage and kale were straightforward but effective. The most common approach was to boil the leaves in water or add them to pottage. By the later Middle Ages, recipes for cabbage appear in cookbooks, though these sources primarily reflect elite cooking rather than peasant practices. The 14th century cookbook Levier de Taillon includes a recipe for cabbage that involves parboiling and then finishing with fat, a technique likely adapted from common practice for peasants. Cabbage was typically prepared more simply, often boiled with a small piece of bacon or salt pork when available, or with just salt when meat was scarce. Other leafy greens supplemented the diet when available. Spinach, introduced to Europe through Islamic Spain and Italy, gradually spread northward during the later Middle Ages. Beet greens, chard, and areca, leafy vegetables similar to spinach, appear in archaeological seed assemblages from peasant sites, indicating their cultivation. These tender greens provided welcome variety during the growing season, but lacked the storage potential of cabbage and kale. The humble status of these vegetables is reflected in medieval terminology and literature. The term cabbage garden was sometimes used metaphorically to indicate something of little value, while in many regions cabbage was considered emblematic of peasant identity. Despite this low social status, these leafy greens were nutritional powerhouses that helped sustain the medieval population through seasons of plenty and scarcity alike. Onions, leeks, and garlic flavoring, and medicine, the allium, family onions, leeks, garlic, and their relatives occupied a special place in the medieval peasant diet, serving as both essential flavoring agents and important medicinal resources. These pungent vegetables appear consistently in archaeological, documentary, and artistic evidence from the period, indicating their widespread cultivation and use across all social classes. Onions were perhaps the most commonly grown allium in medieval gardens. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites reveals carbonized onion remains, and the distinctive papery outer skins that preserve well in certain conditions at the medieval village of Warrenpersey in Yorkshire. Excavations of peasant dwellings uncovered storage areas containing onion remains, suggesting they were grown and stored in significant quantities. Unlike many vegetables that were primarily seasonal, onions could be preserved through much of the year through simple drying or storage in cool, dry conditions, making them a reliable food resource. The medieval onion differed somewhat from modern varieties. Historical records and artistic depictions suggest they were typically smaller and more intensely flavored. Multiple varieties were cultivated, including small pearl-like onions and larger storage types. The 13th century agricultural writer Petro de Crescenzi described several onion varieties, noting their different storage properties and uses. Leeks held particular importance in Welsh and Northern European peasant diets. More cold-hardy than onions, leeks could remain in the ground through winter in many regions, providing fresh vegetables when little else was available. Archaeological evidence for leek cultivation includes the recovery of seeds and pollen from medieval garden sites at Copperate in York. Excavations revealed leek seeds in garden plots behind modest dwellings, indicating their cultivation by ordinary households. The cultural significance of leeks is reflected in their adoption as a national symbol of Wales, reportedly dating back to a battle in 640 CE when Welsh soldiers wore leeks in their helmets to distinguish themselves from their Saxon enemies. By the medieval period, leeks were firmly established as both a dietary staple and a cultural identifier in Wales and parts of northern Britain. Garlic, with its more intense flavor and stronger medicinal properties, was widely grown in peasant gardens across Europe. Archaeological evidence for garlic cultivation includes the recovery of cloves and bulb fragments. From numerous sites, garlic was particularly valued for its preservation properties and medicinal uses. Medieval medical texts consistently recommended garlic for treating a wide range of ailments, from respiratory infections to intestinal parasites. The 12th century medical compendium, known as the Salernitan Regimen of Health, advised if garlic is eaten, its harmful effects are neutralized by a drink of fresh milk. The cultivation of these alliums was, well, suited to peasant agriculture. All could be grown in small garden plots, required minimal tending, once established and produced reliably, even in poor soil. They were typically propagated vegetatively by planting bulbs or bulbils, rather than seeds, allowing peasants to maintain their own planting stock year after year without purchasing new seed. This self-sufficiency made alliums particularly valuable in the subsistence economy of medieval villages. The preservation of alliums for year-round use employed several methods. The simplest was natural storage. Mature onions and garlic harvested in late summer and dried thoroughly to keep for months in cool, dry conditions. Archaeological evidence from peasant dwellings frequently reveals storage areas where strings of onions and garlic would have hung from rafters. Another preservation method involved chopping and drying alliums, creating a shelf-stable flavoring agent for winter use. In some regions, particularly around the Mediterranean, onions were preserved in vinegar or brine, creating pickled condiments that added flavor to the winter diet. The culinary uses of alliums in peasant cooking were diverse and essential. As flavoring agents, they added depth and character to otherwise bland pottages and stews. A small amount of chopped onion or leek could transform a simple grain porridge into a more satisfying meal. Alliums were also frequently combined with herbs and stuffings for occasional meat dishes on feast days. The 14th century English cookbook, The Form of Cury, includes numerous recipes using onions and leeks, suggesting their importance across social classes beyond their culinary applications. Alliums played crucial medicinal roles in peasant households in an era before antibiotics. Their natural antimicrobial properties made them valuable treatments for common ailments. Medieval medical texts consistently recommended alliums for treating coughs, colds, and digestive problems. Archaeological evidence from cesspits at peasant dwellings sometimes reveals higher concentrations of allium remains during winter months, possibly indicating increased consumption for health purposes during cold and flu season. The social and cultural significance of alliums extended beyond their practical uses. In many regions, they featured in folk beliefs and superstitions. Garlic was widely believed to ward off evil influences and disease, a belief that has some scientific basis. Given its antimicrobial properties, onions sometimes served as weather predictors. According to folk wisdom, thicker onion skins predicted a harsh winter ahead. These cultural associations reinforced the importance of alliums in peasant life and ensured their continued cultivation despite their strong flavor and odor. Or perhaps because of it, alliums were sometimes associated with peasant identity in medieval literature and art. The distinctive smell that lingered after consuming raw garlic or onions was considered a marker of lower status. Nevertheless, these humble vegetables provided crucial nutrition and flavor in the peasant diet, turning simple survival foods into more satisfying meals while offering protection against common illnesses. Legumes, peas, beans, and lentils. Legumes, particularly dried peas, broad beans, fave beans, and lentils, formed a critical component of the medieval peasant diet, providing essential protein and calories. When meat was scarce or unaffordable, these humble crops appear consistently in archaeological documentary and artistic evidence from the period, indicating their fundamental importance to everyday nutrition. Dried peas were perhaps the most widely consumed legume across medieval Europe, particularly in northern regions. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites reveals carbonized peas and pea pods in household waste deposits and storage areas at the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Excavations uncovered significant quantities of pea remains in peasant dwellings, while analysis of human remains from the associated cemetery showed wear patterns on teeth consistent with a shared diet high in coarsely ground peas. The medieval pea differed from modern garden varieties. Historical records and archaeobotanical evidence indicate they were typically smaller with tougher skins and a more pronounced flavor. Most peas were grown for drying rather than fresh consumption, allowing them to serve as a storable source of protein and calories throughout the year. The field pea, Pisum sativa arens, was particularly important, being hardier and more reliable than garden varieties. Broad beans, also known as favor or field beans, were the second major legume in the medieval diet. Especially important in Central and Southern Europe, archaeological evidence for broad bean cultivation is abundant. Their larger seeds preserve well in many soil conditions. Excavations at the medieval village of Dracy in Burgundy uncovered storage areas containing significant quantities of broad beans, while pollen analysis from garden plots shows evidence of their cultivation. Lentils, while less common in Northern Europe, were an important protein source in Mediterranean regions and gradually spread northward during the medieval period. Archaeological evidence from Southern European sites consistently reveals lentil remains in household contexts. Their quick cooking time and high nutritional value made them particularly valuable in peasant diets. The cultivation of legumes held special importance in medieval agriculture beyond their nutritional value. As nitrogen-fixing plants, they improve soil fertility when grown in rotation with grains, a practice documented in medieval agricultural manuals. The 13th century writer Walter of Henley advised planting peas or beans after wheat to restore soil productivity, noting that fields treated this way would yield better grain crops in subsequent years. This understanding of crop rotation, while not based on modern scientific knowledge of nitrogen fixation, represented sophisticated agricultural practice that helped maintain soil fertility. In an era before chemical fertilizers, legumes were typically grown both in fields as part of crop rotations and in garden plots near dwellings. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages frequently shows dedicated areas for legume cultivation, sometimes with specialized irrigation systems to support their growth. The practice of growing legumes alongside grains created a complementary protein source that, when combined, provided a more complete amino acid profile than either food alone, though medieval peasants would have understood this benefit only through experience rather than nutritional science. The preservation of legumes for year-round use was straightforward but effective. After harvesting in late summer, peas and beans would be thoroughly dried either by hanging the whole plants or by threshing and drying the seeds. Archaeological evidence from peasant dwellings frequently reveals storage containers specifically designed for dried legumes, including ceramic jars, wooden boxes, and woven baskets lined with clay to protect against rodents and insects. Analysis of carbonized food remains from cooking hearths shows that dried legumes were consumed throughout the year, with particularly heavy use during winter and early spring. When fresh foods were scarce, the culinary uses of legumes in peasant cooking were diverse but centered around a few key preparations. The most common was peas pottage, a thick soup or porridge made from dried peas, cooked with onions, herbs, and occasionally small amounts of salt pork or bacon. When available, this dish was so fundamental to medieval peasant life that it appears repeatedly in literature and historical records as emblematic of the common diet. The English nursery rhyme, peas porridge, hot peas porridge, cold peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old, reflects the reality of this staple. Food, which would indeed be kept simmering for days with fresh ingredients, added as needed. Beans were typically prepared similarly to peas, but required longer soaking and cooking. They might be mashed after cooking to create a thick, protein-rich paste that could be spread on bread or formed into patties and fried in a small amount of fat. Lentils cooked more quickly than other legumes and were often prepared as a soup or stew, sometimes flavored with vinegar or sour wine when available during Lent. And other fast days, when Catholic dietary restrictions prohibited meat consumption, legumes became even more important as protein sources. Church records and household accounts show increased purchases and consumption of dried peas and beans during these periods, even among wealthier households for peasants who rarely ate meat anyway. These restrictions made little practical difference to their diet. The nutritional contribution of legumes to the medieval diet was substantial. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that a typical serving of dried peas provides approximately 8 to 10 g of protein, significant in a diet where animal protein was limited. Equally important was their contribution of complex carbohydrates, fiber, and micronutrients, particularly B vitamins and minerals like iron and zinc. When combined with grains, as they typically were in peasant cooking, legumes created complementary protein combinations that improved overall nutritional quality. Despite their nutritional value, legumes were firmly associated with lower-caste status in medieval culture. In literature and art, peas pottage frequently appears as a symbol of peasant life and poverty. Nevertheless, these humble foods provided crucial nutrition that helped sustain the medieval population through seasons of plenty and scarcity alike. Animal products, occasional protein, dairy, milk, cheese, and butter dairy products occupied a unique position in the medieval peasant diet, more accessible than meat, but still limited by the realities of livestock ownership and seasonal production. For most peasants, dairy foods represented an important but intermittent source of animal protein, fat, and calcium that supplemented their largely plant-based diet. The availability of dairy in peasant households depended on several factors, including regional agricultural practices, individual circumstances, and the time of year. Unlike the nobility, who might own substantial herds, most peasants possessed at most a single cow or a few goats or sheep. Manor records from the 13th and 14th century England suggest that approximately 30 to 40% of peasant households owned a cow, while a larger percentage had access to goats, which required less pasture and were cheaper to maintain. Milk production followed strict seasonal patterns that shaped dairy consumption. Cows and goats would typically give birth in spring, producing milk through summer and early autumn before drying up for winter. This created a natural cycle of abundance and scarcity in dairy foods. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements reflects this seasonality. Analysis of pottery residues from cooking vessels shows higher concentrations of milk fats. In vessels dating to summer months, fresh milk was less common in the medieval peasant diet than modern consumers might expect. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months. More importantly, converting milk into cheese or butter represented a form of preservation that extended the usable life of dairy products. The 14th century household manual Lumendeer advises that milk is of little profit except in cheese, reflecting the practical reality that cheesem converted a highly perishable food into a stable, storable form for peasants who owned a cow. The animal's milk would typically be divided between household consumption, cheese production, and fulfilling memorial obligations. Manor records frequently list dairy products among the rents owed by tenants to their lords. A typical arrangement might require a peasant household to provide a certain quantity of cheese or butter annually as part of their feudal obligations. The Domesday Book and later memorial surveys record these dairy rents in detail, providing insight into production levels and expectations. Cheesem was a crucial skill in peasant households with access to milk. The process converted perishable milk into a food that could be stored for months or even years, providing protein through winter. When milk production ceased, archaeological evidence for cheese includes specialized vessels with holes for draining whey from curds. Excavations at the deserted medieval village of Wareham, Percy, uncovered several such cheese molds in peasant dwellings, confirming household-level production. Medieval peasant cheeses were typically simple, unaged varieties, made from whatever milk was available, cow, goat, or sheep. Depending on the region and household circumstances, these fresh cheeses resembled modern cottage cheese, farmer's cheese, or simple pressed cheeses rather than complex aged varieties. The simplest form, known variously as green cheese, white cheese, or fresh cheese, could be made in a single day and consumed within weeks. More pressed and salted varieties could last through winter if properly stored. Butter represented another important dairy product, valued particularly for its fat content. In a diet that was often lacking in calories from fat, butter equipment appears consistently in archaeological assemblages from peasant dwellings. Wooden butter churns and ceramic vessels with distinctive wear patterns associated with churning have been recovered from numerous sites at the medieval village of Rattray in Scotland. Excavations uncovered a wooden butter churn preserved in waterlogged conditions, providing rare insight into the actual tools used by peasant households. Unlike modern refrigerated butter, medieval butter was typically heavily salted for preservation or clarified by heating to remove water content, similar to getchi, allowing it to keep for extended periods without spoiling. Butter was used sparingly as a cooking fat or spread on bread on special occasions during Lent and other fast days. When animal products were restricted, butter was technically prohibited, though archaeological evidence suggests compliance varied by region and economic circumstance. For peasants without their own milk-producing animals, dairy products might still be obtained through several channels. Many villages had communal herds where those without private pasture could place an animal receiving a share of milk or cheese proportional to their contribution. Archaeological and documentary evidence from medieval villages frequently references these communal arrangements. The physical layout of many medieval villages included common pastures and dedicated cheesem facilities indicating cooperative dairy production. Another source of dairy for peasants without livestock was payment for labor. Manor accounts frequently show cheese or butter given as partial payment for seasonal agricultural work, particularly during haymaking and harvest, when additional labor was needed. The accounts of the Bishop of Winchester's estates from the 13th century record numerous instances of cheese distributed to harvest workers as part of their compensation. The nutritional contribution of dairy products to the medieval peasant diet, even in small amounts, was significant. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that even modest quantities of cheese or butter would have provided essential fats, soluble vitamins, particularly A and D calcium, and complete protein that complemented the largely plant-based diet. In a diet centered around grains and vegetables, these nutrients help to prevent deficiencies that might otherwise have been common. Regional variations in dairy consumption were substantial across medieval Europe in alpine regions where steep terrain favored pastoral rather than arable farming. Dairy foods formed a larger proportion of the peasant diet. Archaeological evidence from medieval alpine settlements shows more specialized dairy processing equipment and larger storage facilities for cheese. In contrast, peasants in grain-growing regions of Central Europe typically had more limited access to dairy, with cheese and butter serving as occasional supplements rather than dietary staples. The cultural and religious significance of dairy products added another dimension to their role in peasant life. Church regulations concerning fasting created a complex relationship with dairy foods during Lent. And other fast days, milk, cheese, and butter were technically prohibited, along with meat. However, archaeological evidence from medieval settlements suggests these restrictions were not always strictly observed, particularly among the peasantry. Analysis of food residues from cooking pots used during Lenten periods sometimes reveals traces of dairy fats, indicating practical considerations often outweighed religious observance. When survival was at stake, eggs, the accessible protein eggs, represented one of the most accessible forms of animal protein for medieval peasants, requiring far less investment than meat production while providing high-quality nutrition. The humble chicken capable of producing eggs with minimal feed requirements was within reach of even relatively poor households. Making eggs a crucial component of the peasant diet across much of Europe, archaeological evidence consistently demonstrates the importance of poultry keeping in medieval peasant communities. Excavations at numerous rural sites have uncovered chicken bones and household middens, eggshell fragments and waste deposits, and occasionally the remains of simple chicken coops or enclosures at the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Analysis of household waste revealed eggshell fragments in nearly every dwelling, suggesting widespread chicken keeping among the peasant population. Documentary evidence reinforces this archaeological picture. Memorial records frequently list eggs among the rents owed by peasant tenants to their lords, indicating that egg production was common enough to be a reliable form of payment. The 100 Rolls of 1279, a survey of land holdings in parts of England, records numerous instances of tenants owing dozens or even hundreds of eggs annually. As part of their feudal obligations, these records suggest that even relatively modest peasant households might keep a small flock of hens. The medieval chicken was quite different from modern commercial breeds, smaller and leaner. These birds produced fewer eggs, perhaps 60 to 80 annually, compared to the 250 to 300 laid by modern hens. However, they were hardier, required less specialized feed, and could largely fend for themselves by foraging around the village and fields. Archaeological remains of chickens from medieval sites show they were typically about half the size of modern broilers, with characteristics closer to heritage breeds like the Old English game or Dorking chicken keeping fit neatly into the medieval peasant economy, these birds required minimal space and could convert kitchen scraps, insects, and forage seeds into valuable protein, unlike larger livestock that competed with humans for grain or required dedicated pasture chickens could be maintained on marginal resources. They provided not only eggs, but also occasional meat. When hens stopped laying feathers for bedding and manure for garden plots, the seasonal pattern of egg production shaped their role in the peasant diet. Hens laid most prolifically during spring and summer, with production declining or ceasing entirely during winter months when daylight hours shortened. This natural cycle creates periods of abundance and scarcity that influence consumption patterns. Archaeological evidence reflects this seasonality analysis of eggshell. Fragments from medieval waste deposits shows higher concentrations in layers corresponding to spring and summer months. During peak production seasons, eggs would be consumed fresh, providing a valuable protein supplement to the grain and vegetable-based diet. Medieval cookbooks and household manuals described numerous egg preparations, from simple boiled or fried eggs to more complex dishes combining eggs with vegetables or bread. While these written sources primarily reflect elite cooking practices, they offer glimpses of simpler preparations that would have been accessible to peasants. Preservation methods extended the availability of eggs beyond the laying season. The simplest approach was to submerge eggs in various solutions, lime water, salt water, or ash mixtures that sealed the porous shells and prevented spoilage. Archaeological evidence for this practice includes specialized ceramic vessels with distinctive residues consistent with egg preservation excavations at a 14th century peasant dwelling in Leicester uncovered a partially intact ceramic container with eggshell fragments and mineral deposits consistent with lime preservation. Another preservation method involved hard boiling eggs and then immersing them in vinegar or brine, creating pickled eggs that could last for weeks or months. This technique appears in several medieval household manuals, including Lure Energy de Pari, which provides detailed instructions for preserving eggs through various methods. Depending on the intended storage duration, the nutritional contribution of eggs to the medieval peasant diet was significant even when consumed in modest quantities. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that eggs provided high-quality, complete protein, essential fatty acids, vitamins, particularly A, D, and B12, and minerals including iron and selenium. In a diet otherwise dominated by plant foods, these nutrients helped prevent deficiencies that might otherwise have been common. Eggs also played an important role in medieval religious observance and folk traditions. Easter eggs, symbolizing rebirth, and the end of Lenten fasting appear in numerous medieval records and artistic depictions. Church accounts from the period sometimes record the distribution of eggs to parishioners. After Easter services, this religious significance added cultural value to eggs beyond their nutritional importance. The economic value of eggs in the peasant household extended beyond direct consumption. As a readily marketable commodity, eggs could be sold or bartered for other necessities. Market records from medieval towns show eggs among the most commonly traded items brought by peasants from surrounding villages. This convertibility made chicken keeping particularly valuable for peasant women who typically managed poultry and often controlled the income from egg sales, providing a rare source of economic agency in a highly patriarchal society. Regional variations in egg consumption reflected different agricultural patterns and cultural preferences. In areas where grain cultivation dominated, eggs often represented the most accessible animal protein for peasant households. In pastoral regions, dairy products might play a larger role, with eggs serving as a secondary protein source. Environmental conditions also influenced chicken keeping practices in colder northern regions. Winter egg production was more limited. While Mediterranean areas enjoyed more consistent laying throughout the year, the humble egg, often overlooked in discussions of medieval diets in favor of more prestigious foods like meat, was in fact one of the most important animal proteins available to ordinary people. Archaeological and documentary evidence consistently shows that eggs were not occasional luxuries, but regular components of the peasant diet, modest in quantity, perhaps, but crucial for nutritional adequacy in a diet otherwise dominated by plant foods, fish, fresh, dried, and fermented fish, and other aquatic foods played a crucial role in the medieval peasant diet, particularly in coastal regions along rivers and lakes, and during religious fast days when meat was prohibited, while fresh fish was often a luxury beyond peasant means. Preserved fish, dried, salted, smoked, or fermented provided vital protein even for inland communities far from major water bodies. The importance of fish in medieval diet was magnified by the Catholic Church's dietary regulations, with nearly half the year designated as fast days when terrestrial animal products were prohibited. Fish became the primary permissible protein source during these periods. While wealthier classes might enjoy fresh fish, even on inland tables, peasants typically relied on preserved varieties that could withstand transportation and storage without spoiling. Archaeological evidence for fish consumption among medieval peasants comes from several sources. Fish bones recovered from household waste deposits provide direct evidence of the species. Consumed at the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Excavations uncovered fish bones in peasant dwellings, despite the site's inland location indicating consumption of preserved fish transported from coastal areas. Analysis of human remains from associated cemeteries using stable isotope analysis confirms significant marine protein in the diet even at inland sites for peasants living near coasts, rivers, or lakes. Fresh fish was more accessible. Archaeological evidence from medieval fishing villages shows specialized equipment for capturing different species. Net weights, fish hooks of various sizes, and traps made from woven materials. Excavations at coastal sites like Meals on the Whirl Peninsula revealed extensive evidence of small-scale fishing activities accessible to ordinary people, including simple boats, net weights, and processing areas where fish were cleaned and prepared for preservation. The species consumed varied dramatically by region and accessibility. Coastal peasants might catch and consume a wide variety of marine species, while those inland typically had access to a more limited range of freshwater fish or preserved marine species. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites shows this regional variation clearly at coastal settlements in Scandinavia, and the Baltic herring bones predominate in peasant middens, while inland sites in Central Europe show a preponderance of freshwater species like pike perch and various sapronids. Carp family herring deserves special mention as perhaps the most important fish in the medieval European diet. Particularly for ordinary people, these small oily fish could be caught in enormous quantities during their seasonal migrations and were easily preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites across northern Europe shows herring bones as the most common fish remains. In peasant contexts, historical records document the scale of the herring trade. By the 14th century, millions of herring were being caught annually in the North and Baltic Seas, with a significant portion reaching inland markets, as preserved fish preservation methods were crucial for making fish accessible to inland populations. The simplest was air drying, particularly effective in cold northern regions where bacterial decomposition was slower. Archaeological evidence for fish drying includes specialized structures with evidence of hanging racks at medieval sites in Norway and Iceland. Excavations have uncovered drying sheds where cod and other whitefish were processed for long-term storage, and export salting was another common preservation method, particularly for fatty fish like herring that didn't dry well. Archaeological evidence includes specialized containers for salt storage and processing areas where fish were layered with salt. The resulting product, heavily salted fish that could last for months or even years, required soaking before consumption to remove excess salt fermentation, a preservation method particularly important in Scandinavian regions, produced strongly flavored products like Swedish siraming or Norwegian rackfisk. Archaeological evidence for fermented fish production includes specialized barrels and pits with distinctive chemical residues. For inland peasants, preserved fish was typically purchased at markets or obtained through trade rather than produced domestically. Market records from medieval towns consistently show preserved fish among the goods available for purchase, often at prices accessible even to relatively poor consumers. Memorial accounts sometimes record the purchase of preserved fish for distribution to workers during harvest time or other periods of intensive labor, indicating its value as a portable protein. Rich food. Religious regulations not only increased demand for fish, but also stimulated infrastructure development that made fish more accessible to ordinary people. Monasteries frequently constructed fish ponds to ensure supplies during fast days, and some of these eventually became community resources. Archaeological excavations at numerous monastic sites have uncovered elaborate systems of fish ponds, often with evidence of management techniques like controlled breeding and harvesting. By the later Middle Ages, similar ponds appeared on manorial estates and even in some peasant communities providing fresh fish. Locally, the nutritional contribution of fish to the medieval peasant diet was significant even when consumed in modest quantities. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that preserved fish provided not only protein, but also essential omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, iodine, and other micronutrients that might otherwise have been lacking in a diet dominated by plant foods. For inland populations with limited access to dairy, fish often represented the primary source of vitamin D, crucial for calcium absorption and bone health. Regional variations in fish consumption reflected not only proximity to water bodies, but also cultural preferences and preservation technologies in Scandinavian regions. Dried and fermented fish formed a dietary staple consumed almost daily by many households. Archaeological evidence from medieval Scandinavian sites shows fish bones constituting up to 70% of animal remains in some peasant middens. In Mediterranean regions, smaller fish like anchovies and sardines were often preserved in oil or salt, while in Central Europe, freshwater species predominated in peasant diets, supplemented by imported preserved marine fish. The economic value of fish extended beyond direct consumption. Fishing rights were valuable assets, often controlled by manorial lords or monasteries, but sometimes available to peasant communities through customary arrangements. Historical records document complex systems of rights and responsibilities related to fishing in various waters. Some peasant communities held collective fishing rights in local waters, while others might have access only during specific seasons or for particular species. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that fishing represented an important supplementary activity for many peasant households, particularly during agricultural slack periods. Seasonal migrations of certain fish species like salmon or eel runs provided opportunities for significant protein harvesting that could be preserved for later use. Excavations at medieval rural sites frequently uncover fishing equipment alongside agricultural tools, indicating the complementary nature of these activities in the peasant economy. By the later Middle Ages, commercial fishing had developed into a significant industry with specialized fishing villages supplying urban markets and inland regions. Archaeological evidence from these communities shows increasingly specialized equipment and processing facilities, while professional fishermen gradually dominated commercial production. Small-scale fishing. 4. Household consumption remained accessible to peasants with access to appropriate waters, providing a valuable supplement to their agricultural production meat. The rare luxury meat occupies a paradoxical position in discussions of medieval peasant diet, often assumed to be entirely absent, yet consistently appearing in archaeological and documentary evidence, albeit in quantities and forms quite different from elite consumption patterns. For most peasants, meat was indeed a luxury, but not one entirely beyond reach. Rather, it appeared on their tables infrequently in small portions and often in forms considered undesirable by wealthier consumers. Archaeological evidence provides the most direct window into actual meat consumption patterns among medieval peasants. Analysis of animal bones from household waste deposits at numerous rural sites shows a consistent pattern. Meat was consumed but in limited quantities and often from specific sources. At the deserted medieval village of Warren, Percy, in Yorkshire, excavations of peasant dwellings revealed animal bones constituting approximately 10 to 15% of food waste, a significant proportion, but far less than the 30 to 40% typical of urban or elite sites from the same period. The species represented in peasant middens tells a revealing story. While elite households consumed young animals, particularly lamb and veal, and preferred cuts, peasant assemblages show a predominance of older animals, particularly those that had served other purposes during their lives. Bones of elderly dairy cows, worn-out oxen, and aged sheep appear frequently in peasant contexts. Animals slaughtered only after their productive working lives had ended at the medieval village of West Cotton in Northamptonshire. Zoo archaeological analysis revealed that most cattle bones came from animals at least 8 to 10 years old, indicating slaughter only after years of service. As draft animals, pigs represent a partial exception to this pattern. Archaeological evidence shows that pigs were often kept specifically for meat production, even by peasant households, as they provided no secondary products like milk or wool. Pig bones appear consistently in peasant middens, though typically from smaller, leaner animals than those consumed by elites. The medieval pig was quite different from modern breeds. Longer-legged, more active, and largely self-sufficient, foraging in woodlands for acorns, nuts, and roots. This foraging ability made pigs particularly valuable in the peasant economy, as they could convert otherwise inedible woodland resources into protein. Documentary evidence complements this archaeological picture. Memorial records frequently show peasant households owning small numbers of livestock, including animals kept primarily for meat. The 100 Rolls of 1279, a survey of land holdings in parts of England, records numerous instances of even relatively modest peasant households owning a pig or two alongside their working animals. Court rolls occasionally mention disputes over animal ownership or damages caused by animals, providing incidental evidence of peasant livestock. Keeping the seasonal pattern of meat consumption shaped its role in the peasant diet. Most slaughtering occurred in late autumn, when animals were at their fattest, after summer grazing, and when cold weather facilitated preservation. This created an annual cycle of relative abundance and scarcity. Archaeological evidence reflects this seasonality. Analysis of butchery marks on bones shows different patterns in different seasons, with more evidence of preservation techniques like smoking or salting on bones deposited in autumn contexts. Preservation methods were crucial for extending the availability of meat beyond slaughter time. Salting was perhaps the most common approach, particularly for pork. Archaeological evidence for meat preservation includes specialized containers for salt storage and occasional remains of smoking structures at the medieval village of Rattray. In Scotland, excavations uncovered a small smoking chamber with distinctive residues and bone fragments, indicating household-level meat preservation. The parts of animals consumed by peasants differed significantly from elite preferences, while the wealthy favored prime cuts. Peasants utilized virtually every edible portion of the animal, including organs, heads, feet, and blood. Archaeological evidence from peasant contexts frequently includes bones from these less desirable parts. At numerous medieval village sites, excavations have uncovered disproportionate numbers of skull fragments and foot bones in peasant middens, indicating consumption of heads and trotters that would have been rejected by wealthier households. Blood-tripe lungs and other offal were particularly important in peasant cuisine, providing nutrition from parts that required no long-term feeding of the animal. These fifth-quarter foods left few archaeological traces, but appear in documentary sources. The 14th century household manual Le Meunier de Paris includes recipes for blood puddings and organ preparations, noting that these were common foods among ordinary people. Hunting provided another potential source of meat, though access was severely restricted by forest laws that reserved game animals for the nobility. Nevertheless, archaeological evidence from peasant sites occasionally includes bones from wild species, particularly small game like rabbits, hares, and birds that might be taken with simple traps or snares. The frequency of these remains varies significantly by region and period, reflecting different levels of enforcement of hunting restrictions. Court records document numerous cases of peasants prosecuted for poaching, indirectly confirming that some did risk punishment to supplement their diet with wild game domestic poultry. Particularly, chickens represented a more accessible source of meat than larger livestock. Archaeological evidence consistently shows chicken bones in peasant middens, though typically from older birds past their productive egg-laying years. Memorial records occasionally mention fowl among the rents owed by peasant tenants, indicating widespread chicken-keeping. Geese appear less frequently in peasant context, but were kept by some households, particularly in regions with access to suitable grazing areas. The nutritional contribution of even limited meat consumption to the medieval peasant diet was significant. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that meat provided not only protein, but also essential micronutrients, particularly iron, zinc, and B vitamins, including B12, that are difficult to obtain from plant sources alone. In a diet otherwise dominated by grains and vegetables, even occasional meat consumption helped prevent deficiencies that might otherwise have been common. Religious regulations concerning meat consumption created complex patterns of observance and adaptation. Catholic dietary rules prohibited meat on Fridays during Lent and on numerous other fast days, totaling nearly half the year. Archaeological evidence suggests compliance. Varied analysis of food remains from different seasonal contexts shows reduced but not eliminated meat consumption during traditional fasting periods, particularly among rural populations. Regional variations in meat consumption reflected different agricultural patterns and environmental conditions. In upland areas less suitable for grain cultivation, pastoral farming predominated, and meat formed a larger proportion of the peasant diet. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites in mountainous regions of Wales, Scotland, and Alpine Europe shows higher proportions of animal bones in household contexts compared to lowland agricultural villages. In contrast, peasants in grain-growing regions typically had more limited access to meat, with animal products serving as occasional supplements rather than dietary staples. The cultural significance of meat extended beyond its nutritional value. Feast days and celebrations typically involved meat consumption, even among relatively poor households. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages shows different patterns of animal remains in contexts associated with seasonal festivals or life cycle events like weddings. The types of animals consumed on these occasions often differed from everyday patterns. Pig bones are particularly associated with Christmas and winter feasting, while lamb appears more frequently in spring contexts, especially around Easter, While meat was indeed a luxury for medieval peasants, it was not an unattainable one. Rather, it appeared on their tables infrequently in small portions and often in forms considered undesirable by wealthier consumers. This pattern of occasional waste-minimizing meat consumption represents a sustainable approach to animal protein that maximized nutritional benefit while minimizing resource use, a model that has gained renewed interest in contemporary discussions of sustainable food systems. Gathered and foraged foods, wild greens and herbs beyond the cultivated garden plots and fields. Medieval peasants relied heavily on wild plant foods gathered from the surrounding landscape. These foraged greens and herbs provided crucial nutritional diversity, medicinal benefits, and flavor to an otherwise monotonous diet. The knowledge required to identify, harvest, and prepare these wild foods represented a sophisticated ecological understanding passed down through generations. Archaeological evidence for wild plant consumption comes primarily from the analysis of plant remains from medieval sites. Seeds, pollen, and occasionally preserved plant tissues recovered from household mittens, cesspits, and cooking vessels provide direct evidence of the species utilized at the medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Archaeobotanical analysis identified remains of numerous wild greens, including nettles, fat hen, Chenopodium album, sorrel, and dandelion. In household context, similar patterns appear at sites across Europe, with the specific species varying by region and local ecology. The seasonal nature of wild plant gathering created an annual cycle of changing greens that complemented the agricultural calendar. Spring was particularly important for wild greens, providing fresh nutrients after winter months, when vegetables were scarce. Archaeological and documentary evidence indicates intense gathering activity during this period. The 12th century Abbess Hildegard of Bingen noted that spring greens were valued for purifying the blood after winter, a pre-scientific understanding of their nutritional benefits. After months of limited vegetable consumption, nettles Ica deserve special mention as perhaps the most important wild green in the medieval peasant diet across much of Europe. These highly nutritious plants appear consistently in archaeological samples from medieval sites at West Cotton in Northamptonshire. Archaeobotanical analysis found nettle seeds in numerous cooking contexts, indicating their regular consumption high in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. Nettles provided crucial micronutrients that might otherwise have been lacking in the winter-depleted diet of early spring. The stinging hairs that make raw nettles challenging to handle are neutralized by cooking, resulting in a spinach-like green that could be added to pottage or prepared as a simple side dish. Fat hen Chenopodium album, also known as lamb's quarters or goosefoot, represents another widely consumed wild green. Archaeological evidence shows its seeds and pollen in numerous medieval contexts. This nutritious relative of quinoa grows readily in disturbed soil, making it common around human settlements. High in protein compared to other leafy greens, fat hen provided valuable nutrition from what modern gardeners would consider a weed. Similar species like Good King Henry Chenopodium bonus henricus were so valued that they were sometimes transplanted closer to dwellings for easier harvesting, blurring the line between wild and cultivated foods. Dandelions, Ptericum arsenal, appear frequently in medieval archaeobotanical samples, particularly from spring contexts. Every part of this plant was utilized: young leaves in salads or cooked greens, flowers for winemaking, and roots for medicinal preparations. Or when dried and ground as a coffee-like beverage, the bitter compounds that give dandelions their distinctive flavor were valued for their digestive properties, reflecting the medieval understanding of food as medicine. Sorrel rump species provided a lemony acidic flavor to the medieval diet. Archaeological evidence shows sorrel seeds in numerous cooking contexts. Its tartness made it particularly valuable for adding flavor to bland pottage or grains. The oxalic acid that creates this sour taste also served practical purposes in food preparation. Sorrel leaves were sometimes used to curdle milk for cheese, making, when traditional rennet was unavailable, wild alliums, including ramsons, wild garlic, alliuminum and field garlic, Allium olerarium, supplemented cultivated onions and garlic. Archaeological evidence for these plants comes primarily from pollen analysis and occasional bulb remains in waterlogged contexts. These flavorful plants provided not only culinary benefits, but also medicinal properties, particularly antimicrobial effects that might have helped prevent foodborne illness when added to dishes. Beyond these common examples, archaeological and documentary evidence indicates consumption of dozens of other wild greens, chickweed, palenmo, plantain, and numerous others depending on regional ecology. Many of these plants are now considered weeds, but were once valued food sources. Analysis of human coprolites, preserved fecal material from medieval cesspits, confirms the regular consumption of these diverse plant foods with identifiable remains of multiple wild species in individual samples. The gathering of wild greens was typically women's work, often combined with other tasks like collecting firewood or tending to animals grazing in common areas. This gendered knowledge transmission created a sophisticated understanding of plant properties, optimal harvesting times, and preparation methods while rarely documented directly. This ecological knowledge can be inferred from the consistent patterns of plant use visible in the archaeological record across generations. Wild herbs gathered for both culinary and medicinal purposes further expanded the peasant pantry. Archaeological evidence from medieval gardens and household contexts shows cultivation of some herbs alongside gathering of wild varieties. Common herbs identified in archaeological samples include mint, thyme, sage, rosemary, and numerous others. Depending on regional availability, these plants added crucial flavor to otherwise bland dishes, while often providing medicinal benefits, a dual purpose that made them particularly valuable in peasant households with limited access to formal health care. The preservation of wild greens for use beyond their growing season employed several methods. Drying was the simplest approach, with bundles of herbs and edible leaves hung from rafters. To dry archaeological evidence for this practice includes specialized drying structures and occasionally preserved dried plant remains in protected contexts like sealed storage areas. Some greens were preserved through fermentation, creating preparations similar to modern sauerkraut. Analysis of residues from ceramic vessels sometimes reveals evidence of these fermentation processes. The nutritional contribution of wild greens to the medieval peasant diet was substantial. Modern nutritional analysis of these plants reveals high concentrations of vitamins, minerals, and beneficial phytochemicals, often at levels exceeding cultivated vegetables. Nettles, for example, contain more iron than spinach and more calcium than milk by weight. In a diet otherwise limited in micronutrient diversity, these wild foods provided crucial nutritional insurance against deficiencies. Regional variations in wild plant use reflected different ecological zones and cultural traditions. Mediterranean peasants gathered different species than their northern European counterparts, while Eastern European traditions incorporated plants unfamiliar in Western regions. This regional diversity created distinctive local cuisines, even within the broader patterns of peasant diet. Archaeological evidence from different regions shows these distinct plant assemblages, with certain species appearing consistently in some areas while absent in others. The medieval church sometimes viewed wild food gathering with suspicion, particularly when it involved plants with folkloric associations to pre-Christian practices. Plants like St. John's wort, mugwort, and certain mushrooms carried dual identities as both food medicine and magical substances. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals these contested plants in household contexts, indicating that practical needs often outweighed religious concerns and daily food practices. The knowledge required to safely utilize wild plants represented a sophisticated form of ecological literacy, distinguishing between edible plants and their toxic lookalikes. Understanding optimal harvesting times and knowing proper preparation methods were literally life or death skills. This knowledge was typically passed down orally through generations of women, creating a parallel system of expertise largely invisible in official written records, but essential to community survival in times of famine or crop failure. This knowledge of wild foods became even more crucial. Historical accounts of famine periods describe increased reliance on foraged foods, sometimes including plants not normally consumed. Archaeological evidence from periods of known food scarcity shows broader ranges of wild plant remains in household contexts, confirming these historical accounts during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Chronicles report people consuming plants normally considered inedible, including tree bark and certain roots. While these accounts may contain elements of exaggeration, they reflect the real expansion of foraging practices during crisis periods. The gathering of wild greens and herbs represented not just a supplement to the peasant diet, but an essential component of medieval food security, a flexible, responsive system that could adapt to changing conditions and provide crucial nutrients when cultivated foods were scarce. This sophisticated ecological knowledge, developed over generations and finely tuned to local environments, formed an often overlooked dimension of medieval peasant survival strategies. Nuts, berries and fruits, wild and semi-wild fruits. Berries and nuts formed another crucial component of the medieval peasant diet, providing essential nutrients, variety, and occasional sweetness in a food system dominated by grains and vegetables. These foods were harvested from forests, hedgerows, commons, and marginally managed orchards, representing an important interface between cultivated and wild food systems. Archaeological evidence for the consumption of these foods comes from several sources. Seeds, pits, and shells preserve well in many soil conditions, providing direct evidence of the species utilized at numerous medieval village sites. Excavations have uncovered concentrated deposits of fruit stones, nutshells, and berry seeds in household middens and cesspits at the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire. Archaeobotanical analysis identified remains of crabapples, Slow's blackberries, elderberries, hazelnuts, and walnuts in household contexts, indicating regular consumption of these woodland and hedgerow foods. Hazelnuts, Corylus avellana, were perhaps the most important wild nut across much of Europe, appearing consistently in archaeological samples from medieval sites high in protein, healthy fats, and calories. Hazelnuts provided concentrated nutrition that could be stored for months. Archaeological evidence includes not only the nutshells, but occasionally specialized tools for processing nuts at several medieval village sites. Stone or wooden nutcrackers have been recovered, indicating the importance of these foods in the peasant diet. Walnuts, Juglan raya, and chestnuts, Castana sativa, were significant in regions where these trees were common, particularly in southern and central Europe. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites in these regions show substantial quantities of nutshells in household contexts in parts of France, Italy, and Spain. Chestnuts were so important that they approached the status of a staple food rather than a supplement. Analysis of human remains from medieval cemeteries in these regions sometimes shows isotopic signatures consistent with significant chestnut consumption. Acorns, while not commonly associated with human food today, appear in archaeological contexts from some medieval sites, particularly in regions with extensive oak forests. These nutrient-dense nuts required processing to remove bitter tannins, but provided valuable calories in times of scarcity. Documentary evidence mentions acorn consumption primarily during famines. But archaeological findings suggest more regular use in some regions, particularly as a flower extended during winter months when grain supplies ran low. Wild berries provided crucial vitamins and variety to the peasant diet, particularly during summer and early autumn. Archaeological evidence consistently shows seeds from blackberries rubus, fruicosus, elderberries sambucus, negra bilberries vaccinium motillus, and numerous other species in medieval household contexts. Analysis of human coprolites from medieval cesspits sometimes reveals berry seeds, providing direct evidence of consumption at a 14th century cesspit in York. Archaeologists identified blackberry, raspberry, and elderberry seeds in preserved fecal material, confirming their dietary importance. These berries were typically consumed fresh during their brief seasonal availability, providing rare sweetness in a diet with limited access to honey or other sweeteners. Some were also preserved through drying or fermentation for winter use. Archaeological evidence for berry preservation includes specialized drying racks and ceramic vessels with residues consistent with fermented berry preparations. The 14th century household manual Lure Menier Deer includes instructions for preserving berries in honey or wine techniques that might have been adapted by peasant households using smaller quantities of these precious ingredients. Crab apples, Maris sylvestris, and wild pears Pyrus prista represented important tree fruits gathered from woodlands and hedgerows. Archaeological evidence includes pits and occasionally preserved fruit remains in waterlogged contexts. These fruits were typically smaller, harder, and more astringent than their modern cultivated counterparts, but provided valuable nutrition and flavor, often too tart for fresh eating. They were commonly used in cooking or fermented into cider or perry. Archaeological evidence for these practices includes specialized pressing equipment and ceramic vessels with residues consistent with fermented fruit. Beverages sloes Prunus spinosa, the fruit of the blackthorny, appear frequently in archaeological samples. From medieval sites, these small, extremely astringent fruits were rarely eaten fresh but were used in preserves or more commonly steeped in alcohol to create sloe wine. The resulting beverage provided both calories and medicinal benefits. During winter months, archaeological evidence includes sloe pits and household middens and occasionally specialized vessels for fermenting fruit. Beverages Elderus sambucus negra deserve special mention for their dual culinary and medicinal roles. Archaeological evidence shows elderberry seeds in numerous medieval contexts, while documentary sources mention their use in both food and medicine. The flowers were used to flavor drinks and desserts, while the berries were made into wine preserves or medicinal syrups. Modern research has confirmed the immune-boosting properties of elderberry, suggesting that traditional uses provided real health benefits during winter months when respiratory infections were common. Rose hips, the fruit of wild roses. Rosa species appear in archaeological samples from many medieval sites. These vitamin C-rich fruits were particularly valuable during winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Archaeological evidence includes seeds and occasionally preserved fruit flesh in waterlogged or mineralized contexts. Rose hips were typically dried for winter use or processed into syrups and preserves. The high vitamin C content, up to 20 times that of oranges by weight, made these humble fruits a crucial protection against scurvy during winter months. While wild gathering provided most fruits and nuts, some peasant households maintained simple orchards or fruit trees near their dwellings. Archaeological evidence from medieval village sites occasionally reveals the remains of small orchards with deliberately planted fruit trees. Pollen analysis from these areas shows higher concentrations of fruit tree pollen than would occur naturally, indicating intentional cultivation. Documentary evidence, including manorial surveys and wills, sometimes mentions fruit trees as valuable assets passed down through generations. The legal status of wild fruits and nuts created complex patterns of access and restriction, while forests were typically owned by nobility or the church. Customary rights often allowed peasants to gather certain foods at specific times. The practice of ponage, allowing pigs to forage for acorns and nuts in woodlands, indirectly provided human food through pork, while direct gathering of nuts was sometimes permitted after specific dates. Court records occasionally document disputes over these rights, indicating both their importance to peasant survival and the tension surrounding their exercise. The seasonal nature of these foods created an annual cycle of abundance and scarcity that shaped gathering and preservation practices. Late summer and autumn represented peak harvesting times, with intense activity to collect and preserve these valuable foods before winter. Archaeological evidence reflects this seasonality. Analysis of household waste deposits shows higher concentrations of nutshells in fruit pits. In context dating to autumn months, the nutritional contribution of wild fruits, berries, and nuts to the medieval peasant diet was substantial, even when consumed in modest quantities. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that these foods provided essential vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, and antioxidants, often lacking in the grain-based diet. Rose hips and elderberries, for example, provided crucial vitamin C during winter months, while nuts contributed protein, vitamin E, and essential fatty acids. In a diet otherwise limited in micronutrient diversity, these wild foods provided important nutritional insurance against deficiencies. Regional variations in fruit and nut consumption reflected different ecological zones and forest management practices. Mediterranean peasants had access to a different array of species than their northern European counterparts, while Eastern European forests provided abundant nuts and berries that formed a larger proportion of the diet. In these regions, archaeological evidence from different regions shows these distinct plant assemblages, with certain species appearing consistently in some areas while absent in others. The gathering of wild fruits, nuts, and berries represented not just a supplement to the peasant diet, but an essential component of medieval food security. A flexible, responsive system that could adapt to changing conditions and provide crucial nutrients when cultivated foods were scarce. This practice, combining sophisticated ecological knowledge with practical preservation techniques, formed a crucial dimension of peasant survival strategies throughout the medieval period. Mushrooms and other fungi represented a significant but archaeologically elusive component of the medieval peasant diet. These protein-rich forest foods provided crucial nutritional diversity and distinctive flavors, particularly in woodland regions where they grew abundantly. Despite their importance, their soft tissues rarely preserve in archaeological contexts, making their consumption difficult to document through conventional methods. The evidence for mushroom consumption in medieval Europe comes primarily from indirect archaeological indicators, documentary sources, and ethnographic parallels. Specialized tools for mushroom gathering and processing occasionally appear in archaeological assemblages at several medieval forest-edge settlements in Central Europe. Distinctive curved knives, similar to modern mushroom knives, have been recovered, suggesting specialized gathering practices. Analysis of residues from cooking vessels sometimes reveals chemical compounds consistent with certain mushroom species, providing another line of evidence for their consumption. Documentary sources offer more explicit evidence of mushroom gathering and consumption. Medieval herbals and household manuals occasionally mention edible fungi, though typically with cautions about potential toxicity. The 12th century Abbess Hildegard of Bingen discussed several mushroom varieties in her medical writings, noting both their nutritional and medicinal properties. By the later Middle Ages, more detailed descriptions appear in household guides. The 15th century cookbook Du Cuisine includes recipes using morelses, indicating their accepted culinary status. By this period, the species consumed varied dramatically by region, reflecting different forest ecologies and cultural traditions. In Central and Eastern European forests, Porcini, Boletus edulis, and other bits were particularly important, as were various species of Lactarius and Rustella. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites in these regions occasionally include specialized drying structures that ethnographic parallels suggest were used for mushroom preservation in Western Europe. Field mushrooms, Agera species, were more commonly consumed, growing in meadows and pastures rather than forests. Morels's Morella species held special status across much of Europe due to their distinctive appearance, which made them easily identifiable, even by those with limited mycological knowledge. Archaeological evidence for morel consumption includes occasional preserved specimens in waterlogged contexts and, more frequently, residue evidence in cooking vessels. Their spring fruiting provided valuable nutrition during the hunger gap, when winter stores were depleted, but new crops had not yet matured. The seasonal nature of mushroom fruiting created patterns of intense gathering activity during peak periods, particularly autumn, for most woodland species and spring for morels. This seasonality is reflected in folk calendars and traditional knowledge systems that precisely track the timing of different mushroom appearances. While these knowledge systems were rarely documented directly in the medieval period, their sophistication can be inferred from the detailed mushroom law recorded by early modern naturalists, representing traditions that almost certainly extended back centuries. Preservation methods extended the availability of mushrooms beyond their natural fruiting periods. Drying was the most common approach, with mushrooms strung on threads and hung near hearths or in specialized drying structures. Archaeological evidence for this practice includes occasional finds of dried mushroom fragments in protected contexts like sealed storage areas in Eastern Europe, where mushrooms formed a more substantial part of the diet. Ethnographic evidence suggests more elaborate preservation techniques, including fermentation and pickling, were used. Through direct archaeological evidence for these practices in the medieval period remains limited. The nutritional contribution of mushrooms to the medieval peasant diet was significant, even when consumed in modest quantities. Modern nutritional analysis indicates that many wild mushrooms provide substantial protein, up to 35% by dry weight. For some species, B vitamins, selenium, potassium, and other micronutrients. Some species, particularly those exposed to sunlight during growth, also contain vitamin D, rare in plant foods and crucial for calcium absorption in a diet otherwise dominated by grains and vegetables. These nutritional properties made mushrooms particularly valuable. The knowledge required to safely utilize wild mushrooms represented perhaps the most sophisticated form of ecological literacy in medieval food gathering, distinguishing between edible species and their toxic lookalikes required detailed observational skills and knowledge passed down through generations. This expertise was literally life or death. Mistakes could result in serious illness or death from mushroom poisoning. Archaeological and historical evidence occasionally document such tragedies. Analysis of human remains from some medieval burials has identified toxins consistent with fatal mushroom poisoning, while historical chronicles sometimes mention deaths from evil fungi. The cultural status of mushrooms varied significantly across medieval Europe, creating regional differences in consumption patterns in Slavic and Baltic regions. Mushroom gathering and consumption were deeply embedded in cultural practices, with sophisticated knowledge systems for identification and use. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites in these regions shows more specialized tools and processing facilities for mushrooms compared to Western European contexts. In contrast, Anglo-Norman and some Germanic traditions showed greater fungal weariness, with mushrooms more marginally incorporated into the diet. Religious attitudes toward mushrooms created another dimension of complexity. In some Christian traditions, mushrooms carried associations with decay and death due to their growth on dead wood and sudden appearance after rain. These associations occasionally led to suspicion of mushrooms as potentially unwholesome or even demonic. In contrast, other traditions valued mushrooms precisely because they appeared to spring from nothing, a symbol of God's generative power and bounty. These conflicting attitudes influence regional consumption patterns and preservation of mycological knowledge. The gathering of wild mushrooms typically occurred alongside other forest activities, like collecting firewood, hunting, or tending to animals grazing in woodland areas. This integration into broader woodland use patterns made mushroom gathering an efficient supplementary activity rather than a dedicated food quest. Archaeological evidence from medieval forest edge settlements shows this integration through the co-occurrence of tools and facilities for multiple woodland resources in the same household context during times of famine or crop failure. Mushrooms gained even greater importance as emergency foods. Historical accounts of famine periods sometimes mention increased reliance on woodland fungi when field crops failed. The 14th century chronicler Jean de Venette, describing the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, noted that people resorted to roots and mushrooms from the forests when bread became unavailable. While such accounts may contain elements of exaggeration, they reflect the real expansion of woodland foraging during crisis periods. By the later Middle Ages, some mushroom species had begun the transition from foraged to cultivated foods. Archaeological evidence from 15th century monastic sites occasionally reveals structures consistent with primitive mushroom cultivation, typically logs inoculated with mushroom spawn and kept in damp, dark conditions. While these early cultivation efforts primarily occurred in elite or monastic contexts, they indicate the recognized value of fungi as food resources worth the investment of deliberate propagation. Despite their archaeological elusiveness, mushrooms and other fungi represented an important component of the medieval peasant diet, particularly in woodland regions where they grew abundantly, combining high nutritional value with distinctive flavors. These foods added crucial diversity to a diet otherwise dominated by cultivated crops. The knowledge required to safely utilize them represented one of the most sophisticated dimensions of medieval ecological literacy, passed down through generations. As an essential survival skill, beverages, hydration and nutrition, ale, beer, and fermented drinks, fermented beverages, particularly ale and beer, were not mere luxuries in medieval Europe, but essential components of daily nutrition and hydration for peasants across much of northern and central Europe. These grain-based fermented drinks provided significant calories, nutrients, and safe hydration when water sources might be contaminated. Archaeological, documentary, and artistic evidence all confirm the centrality of these beverages in everyday peasant life. The distinction between ale and beer in the medieval period is important for understanding these beverages. Until the widespread adoption of hops in the 14th to 15th centuries, most grain-based fermented drinks were also flavored with various herbs, in a mixture called gruit beer. Strictly speaking, referred to the hopped beverage that gradually replaced traditional ale across much of Europe. Archaeological evidence for both beverages includes specialized brewing equipment, grain processing facilities, and residues in drinking vessels. Archaeological evidence for peasant brewing comes from numerous sources. Excavations at medieval village sites frequently uncover molting floors, specialized surfaces, where grain was allowed to germinate, as the first step in brewing. At the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire, several peasant dwellings contained evidence of molting activities including germinated grain remains and the distinctive floors on which malting occurred. Similar evidence appears at sites across northern Europe, indicating that brewing was a common household activity rather than a specialized craft in many regions. The brewing process itself required specialized equipment that appears consistently in archaeological assemblages, from peasant contexts, ceramic or wooden mash tuns for mixing malted grain with hot water strainers, for separating liquid from grain solids, and fermentation vessels have all been recovered from medieval rural sites at West Cotton in Northamptonshire. Excavations uncovered a complete set of brewing equipment in a modest peasant dwelling, including a large ceramic mash tun with distinctive residues consistent with brewing use. Documentary evidence reinforces this archaeological picture. Memorial records frequently mention brewing equipment among peasant possessions in inventories and wills. The 100 Rolls of 1279, a survey of land holdings in parts of England, records numerous instances of even relatively modest peasant households owning brewing vessels. Court rolls occasionally mention disputes over brewing rights or the quality of ale, providing incidental evidence of the ubiquity of brewing activities. The gender dimensions of medieval brewing are particularly significant in most regions. Brewing was primarily women's work until the later Middle Ages, when it gradually became a male-dominated commercial activity. Archaeological and documentary evidence consistently shows brewing equipment associated with female, gendered household spaces and activities. The term brewster or a loo wife appears frequently in medieval records, referring to women who brewed regularly and often sold surplus ale to neighbors or at local markets. This economic activity provided rare opportunities for women to earn independent income within the constraints of medieval gender roles. The strength and character of peasant ale differed significantly from modern commercial beer. Archaeological evidence and experimental reconstruction suggest it was typically lower in alcohol, perhaps 2 to 3% ABV, cloudier, and less carbonated than modern beverages without hops. As a preservative, traditional ale had a short shelf life of perhaps a week before souring. This created a pattern of frequent small batch brewing rather than large-scale production. Analysis of residues from drinking vessels at medieval sites confirms this character, showing evidence of grains, fermentation byproducts, and various flavoring herbs. The nutritional contribution of ale to the medieval peasant diet was substantial. Modern nutritional analysis of reconstructed medieval ale recipes indicates that a typical serving, about a quart, might provide 400 to 500 calories and significant B vitamins, particularly important in a diet centered around bread and pottage. The partial fermentation process made nutrients in the grain more bioavailable, while the alcohol content, though modest, helped ensure microbiological safety for working peasants engaged in constant physical labor. This caloric contribution was not an indulgence, but a necessary part of meeting daily energy requirements. Consumption patterns reflected this nutritional role rather than recreational drinking. In a modern sense, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that ale was consumed throughout the day as a form of liquid bread, often beginning with a morning draught. Monorecords from 14th century England indicate that a typical adult might consume a gallon or more of weak ale daily, an amount that sounds excessive by modern standards, but represented a significant portion of necessary caloric intake for those engaged in heavy agricultural labor. The transition from traditional ale to hopped beer occurred gradually across Europe during the later Middle Ages, spreading generally from east to west. Archaeological evidence for this transition includes the appearance of hop remains in brewing contexts and changes in brewing equipment to accommodate the different process required for hopped beer. At medieval sites in Germany and the Low Countries, hop remains appear in brewing contexts from the 12th to 13th centuries, while similar evidence in England dates primarily to the 14th to 15th centuries, reflecting the later adoption of hopping in these regions, hops dramatically changed the character and economics of fermented beverages. The preservative properties of hops extended shelf life from days to months, enabling larger-scale production and commercial distribution. Archaeological evidence for this shift includes the development of larger brewing facilities and specialized hop drying kilns for peasants. This transition had mixed effects. While hopped beer lasted longer and traveled better, the more complex production process gradually shifted brewing from household production to specialized commercial brewers, reducing opportunities for women's economic participation and potentially increasing costs for consumers. Beyond ale and beer, other fermented beverages appeared in the peasant repertoire, depending on regional resources. Cider and perry, fermented from apples and pears respectively, were particularly important in regions with abundant fruit trees. Archaeological evidence for these beverages includes specialized pressing equipment and fermentation vessels with distinctive residues in parts of France, England, and northern Spain. Cider represented a significant caloric source when grain was scarce or expensive. Analysis of residues from drinking vessels at sites in these regions confirms regular consumption of fermented fruit beverages alongside grain-based drinks. Mead, fermented from honey and water, appears less frequently in peasant context due to the relative expense of honey. However, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that dilute forms of mead or honey-flavored ales were produced for special occasions, even in relatively modest households at several medieval village sites. Analysis of residues from distinctive drinking vessels associated with feast contexts has revealed evidence of honey fermentation, suggesting special beverages for celebrations and life cycle events. Regional variations in fermented beverages reflected different agricultural patterns and cultural traditions in wine-producing regions. Even peasants might consume dilute wine or wine byproducts like pere, made by adding water to already pressed grape pomace and fermenting the resulting liquid. Archaeological evidence from peasant dwellings in wine-producing regions occasionally includes specialized vessels for wine storage and service, though typically smaller and simpler than those found in elite contexts in Eastern Europe. Cass, a fermented beverage made from rye bread, provided similar nutritional benefits to ale, but required less grain, making it economically advantageous in regions where grain was particularly precious. The social and cultural significance of fermented beverages extended beyond their nutritional role. Brewing created important community bonds through the practice of help ales, cooperative brewing sessions where neighbors would assist each other and share the results. Archaeological evidence for these communal practices includes unusually large brewing vessels found in otherwise modest dwellings, suggesting periodic production beyond household needs. Court records occasionally mention these gatherings, sometimes with concerns about their potential for fostering unsupervised socialization. Religious attitudes toward fermented beverages were generally positive, despite concerns about excess. Monastery accounts show substantial brewing activities, while parish records sometimes mention church ales brewing and drinking events that raised funds for parish expenses. Archaeological evidence from religious sites consistently includes substantial brewing facilities, indicating institutional approval of moderate consumption even during Lent. In other fast days, liquid nourishment from ale was typically permitted. Recognizing its essential nutritional role, the economic dimensions of peasant brewing created important opportunities within the constraints of feudal society. Surplus ale could be sold for cash or bartered for other necessities, providing rare flexibility in an economy otherwise dominated by subsistence production and obligatory payments to lords. Archaeological evidence for this commercial dimension includes standardized measuring vessels, and sometimes specialized structures for serving ale to non-household members. Memorial court records frequently mention regulations concerning ale quality and pricing, indicating the economic importance of this activity. By the later Middle Ages, increasing commercialization and regulation began to change the character of fermented beverage production and consumption. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a gradual shift from ubiquitous household brewing equipment to larger, more specialized facilities in fewer locations. Documentary evidence records the growth of brewing guilds, licensing requirements, and quality regulations that gradually transformed brewing from a household activity to a regulated craft for peasants. This transition often meant purchasing beer rather than producing it, domestically changing both economic patterns and potentially nutritional access. Throughout the medieval period, fermented beverages remained essential components of peasant nutrition, not luxuries, but daily necessities that provided calories, nutrients, and safe hydration. The archaeological and documentary evidence consistently shows that even the humblest households allocated precious grain resources to brewing, recognizing its fundamental importance to survival and well-being in a challenging environment. Water, herbal infusions, and fruit drinks, while fermented beverages played a crucial role in medieval hydration, they were supplemented by water and various non-alcoholic drinks that contributed to daily fluid intake. The common assumption that medieval people avoided water entirely due to contamination concerns oversimplifies a more complex reality revealed by archaeological and documentary evidence. Water consumption in medieval Europe varied dramatically by location, season, and water source quality. Archaeological evidence for water use comes from several sources. Excavations at medieval village sites consistently reveal water management, infrastructure including well springs, and sometimes sophisticated systems for directing and storing water. At the deserted medieval village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire, archaeologists uncovered multiple wells associated with peasant dwellings, some lined with stone or wood to improve water quality. Similar features appear at sites across Europe, indicating significant investment in securing clean water sources. Analysis of human remains from medieval cemeteries provides another line of evidence regarding hydration sources. Stable isotope analysis of tooth enamel can distinguish between individuals who primarily consumed water and those who relied more heavily on fermented beverages. Studies of remains from several medieval village cemeteries show mixed patterns, with some individuals showing isotope signatures consistent with substantial water consumption, while others appear to have relied more heavily on brewed drinks. Documentary evidence complicates the traditional narrative that medieval people avoided water entirely, while medical texts often cautioned against drinking from stagnant or visibly contaminated sources. They frequently recommended clean spring or well water is healthful. The 12th century medical text, known as the Regimen Sanitas Salernitanum, advised from a clear spring drink freely and without fear. Household accounts and monastic records occasionally mention infrastructure investments specifically to secure clean drinking water, indicating its recognized importance. The quality of water sources varied dramatically, creating regional patterns in water consumption. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that in areas with clean, reliable springs or deep wells, water formed a larger proportion of daily fluid intake. In contrast, regions with more contaminated water sources show greater archaeological evidence of brewing equipment and higher estimated ale consumption. This pattern reflects practical adaptation to local environmental conditions. Rather than cultural preferences alone, water purification methods, though primitive by modern standards, show sophisticated understanding of basic principles. Archaeological evidence from some medieval sites reveals charcoal layers in wells and water storage vessels, a technique that effectively remove some contaminants through absorption. Documentary sources occasionally mention boiling water before consumption or adding vinegar or wine in small quantities to make questionable water safer. These practices, while not based on germ theory, nevertheless provided some protection against waterborne illness. Herbal infusions, essentially simple teas, provided another important hydration source. Archaeological evidence for these beverages includes specialized vessels with residues consistent with various herbs, as well as the herbs themselves, recovered from household contexts. At several medieval village sites, excavations have uncovered ceramic vessels with distinctive interior deposits containing compounds from mint, chamomile, linen flowers, and other herbs commonly used for infusions. These herbal drinks served multiple purposes beyond simple hydration. Many had medicinal properties, helping to treat common ailments like digestive problems, coughs, or fevers. The 12th century Abbess Hildegard of Bingen described numerous herbal infusions for specific health conditions, suggesting their widespread use across social classes. Archaeological evidence supports this medicinal dimension. Analysis of residues from drinking vessels sometimes reveals combinations of herbs consistent with treatments described in medieval medical texts. The most common herbs used for infusions vary by region, but typically included locally available plants with pleasant flavors and medicinal properties. Mint species appear frequently in archaeological samples from household contexts across Europe, while chamomile, linen flowers, and various members of the sage family also show consistent evidence of use. Excavations at the medieval village of Rattray in Scotland uncovered a remarkable preservation of dried herbs in a storage container, including several varieties typically used for infusions. Fruit-based drinks provided another hydration option, particularly during summer and autumn, when fruits were abundant. Archaeological evidence for these beverages includes specialized pressing equipment and vessels with distinctive fruit residues. Analysis of residues from drinking vessels at several medieval sites has identified compounds specific to apples, pears, berries, and other fruits, indicating consumption of their juices. The simplest fruit drinks were essentially fresh juices consumed immediately after pressing without fermentation. Documentary sources occasionally mention these fresh drinks, particularly in contexts of hospitality or during harvest work, when quick refreshment was needed. More commonly, fruit juices were partially fermented, creating beverages with lower alcohol content than full cider or perry, but with improved preservation properties compared to fresh juice. Archaeological evidence for these lightly fermented drinks includes vessels with residues showing partial fermentation markers. Another common approach involved infusing water with fruits to create flavored drinks. Archaeobotanical evidence occasionally reveals concentrations of fruit remains associated with specialized vessels, suggesting this practice. The resulting beverages, similar to modern infused waters, provided hydration with improved flavor and some nutritional benefits from the fruit's water-soluble vitamins and compounds. Whey, the liquid byproduct of cheese making, represented another important beverage in peasant households that produced cheese. Archaeological evidence for whey consumption includes specialized vessels with distinctive protein residues consistent with this dairy liquid high in protein. B vitamins and minerals whey provided significant nutritional benefits alongside hydration. Documentary sources occasionally mention whey as a refreshing summer drink, particularly valued during harvest work, when both hydration and nutrition were crucial. The seasonal pattern of beverage consumption created an annual cycle of changing hydration sources. Spring water was often considered at its best quality after winter rains had replenished groundwater, while summer brought fresh fruit juices and infusions from newly available herbs. Autumn featured partially fermented fruit drinks from Harvest Bounty, while winter typically saw greater reliance on fully fermented beverages that could be stored. Archaeological evidence reflects this seasonality analysis of beverage residues from different seasonal contexts, shows changing patterns throughout the year. Children's hydration presents an interesting case study in medieval beverage consumption. While ale and beer were consumed by all age groups, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that children typically received weaker versions or greater proportions of alternative beverages. Analysis of stable isotopes in skeletal remains of children from medieval cemeteries sometimes shows different patterns compared to adults from the same communities, suggesting different hydration sources. Documentary evidence occasionally mentions specific drinks considered appropriate for children, including diluted whey fruit infusions and very weak ale. Regional variations in non-alcoholic beverages reflected different agricultural patterns and available resources in Mediterranean regions. Diluted vinegar drinks similar to modern shrubs appear in both archaeological and documentary evidence. Analysis of residues from drinking vessels at sites in southern Europe occasionally reveals compounds consistent with these vinegar-based refreshments. In Eastern Europe, birch sap, collected in early spring, provided a seasonal beverage rich in minerals and mildly sweet, a practice documented archaeologically through specialized collection vessels and mentioned in various historical sources. The religious dimensions of beverage choice created additional complexity in medieval drinking patterns during Lent and other fast days. Stricter Christians might avoid ale, entirely relying instead on water and herbal infusions. Archaeological evidence from strongly religious communities sometimes shows different beverage residue patterns. In context associated with fasting periods, certain herbs used in infusions carried religious symbolism. Top, for example, was associated with purification and appears more frequently in contexts linked to religious observance. Social and gender patterns influenced beverage consumption as well. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that women and children were more likely to consume non-alcoholic options like herbal infusions and fruit drinks, while working men relied more heavily on the caloric benefits of ale. This pattern appears in analysis of drinking vessel residues from contexts associated with different household members, as well as in stable isotope studies of human remains that can sometimes distinguish between predominantly water-drinking and ailing individuals. The transition from the early to late Middle Ages saw gradual changes in non-alcoholic beverage consumption. Archaeological evidence from later medieval contexts shows increasing specialization in beverage vessels with distinct forms for different drink types, becoming more common. Documentary sources from the 14th and 15th centuries mention a wider variety of prepared non-alcoholic beverages, suggesting greater elaboration of these drinks as part of broader changes in food culture during this period. Throughout the medieval period, water and non-alcoholic beverages remained important components of everyday hydration, not mere alternatives to ale, but complementary drinks with their own valued properties and uses. The archaeological and documentary evidence consistently shows that medieval peasants maintained sophisticated knowledge about water quality, herbal properties, and preservation techniques, creating a diverse hydration strategy adapted to local resources and seasonal availability. The medieval peasant diet, as revealed through archaeological evidence, historical documents, and scientific analysis, represents one of humanity's most successful adaptations to environmental constraints and social inequality. Far from the simplistic portrayal of unrelenting deprivation often presented in popular media, this dietary system demonstrates remarkable ingenuity, nutritional wisdom, and ecological sustainability, qualities that deserve recognition and even admiration from our modern perspective. The foundation of this diet, whole-grain bread, pottage, vegetables, and limited animal products, provided a nutritional profile that, while monotonous by modern standards, was capable of sustaining health and working capacity under challenging conditions. Archaeological analysis of human remains from medieval peasant cemeteries frequently shows individuals who, despite hard physical labor and periodic food shortages, maintained reasonable health into adulthood. The combination of complementary proteins from grains and legumes, micronutrients from wild and cultivated plants, and occasional animal proteins created a diet that, when food was sufficient, met basic nutritional needs. The seasonal rhythm of the medieval peasant diet, from the lean hunger gap of late spring to the relative abundance of harvest time, created patterns of feast and fast that were incorporated into religious observance and community celebrations. This integration of biological necessity with cultural meaning helped communities navigate the inevitable cycles of scarcity and plenty. Archaeological evidence from seasonal deposits shows these changing patterns clearly, with the different food remains dominating in different seasons, creating an annual dietary cycle that followed the agricultural year. Perhaps most impressive was the medieval peasants' sophisticated understanding of food preservation. Without refrigeration, canning, or modern packaging, they developed effective techniques for extending food availability across seasons. Archaeological evidence for these practices, from grain storage pits to smoking chambers, from fermenting vessels to drying structures, appears consistently across medieval sites. These preservation methods not only extended the useful life of foods, but often enhanced their nutritional properties through processes like fermentation, which increases bioavailability of nutrients and creates beneficial compounds not present in the original ingredients. The knowledge required to maintain this food system was transmitted primarily through practical demonstration and oral tradition rather than written texts. Women who performed most food preparation preserved crucial information about wild plant identification, proper processing of potentially toxic ingredients, fermentation management, and countless other skills essential to survival. This knowledge represented a sophisticated form of science developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Even if it wasn't recognized as such by the literate elite who produced most surviving written records, the medieval peasant diet also demonstrated remarkable adaptability. In the face of crisis, historical records document how communities adjusted to crop failures, livestock diseases, or economic disruptions by expanding wild food gathering, substituting alternative ingredients, or developing new preservation techniques. Archaeological evidence from periods of known hardship shows these adaptations in practice, with unusual food remains appearing in contexts associated with famine periods. This resilience, the ability to maintain adequate nutrition through changing strategies rather than rigid dependence on a single food source, helped communities survive challenges that might otherwise have been catastrophic. The ecological footprint of the medieval peasant diet was remarkably light. By modern standards, most food was produced and consumed locally with minimal packaging, and processing animal products were utilized fully, with virtually no edible parts wasted. The integration of livestock into agricultural systems, with animals consuming crop residues and providing manure for fertilizer, created efficient nutrient cycling that maintained soil fertility without external inputs. Even the limited use of wild resources was typically sustainable, with gathering practices that allowed plant populations to regenerate. This is not to romanticize what was undeniably a challenging existence. Periodic famines caused genuine suffering, and even in normal times, the diet lacked the variety and consistent abundance we now take for granted. Archaeological evidence from famine periods shows desperate measures, tree bark and bread, unusual wild plants and cooking vessels, and sometimes evidence of malnutrition in human remains. The physical demands of medieval agricultural labor required substantial caloric intake that wasn't always available. particularly during the Hunger Gap when winter stores were depleted, but new crops hadn't yet matured. Nevertheless, the medieval peasant diet represents a remarkable achievement in human adaptation to constraints with limited technology, restricted access to land and resources, and the burden of supporting a privileged elite through rents and taxes. Medieval peasants developed a food system that sustained the vast majority of the European population for centuries. The knowledge embedded in this system, from crop rotation patterns to wild plant identification, from fermentation management to seasonal preservation techniques, represents a sophisticated body of practical science deserving of recognition. As we face contemporary challenges of food sustainability, climate change, and resource constraints, there are valuable lessons to be learned from this historical dietary system: the emphasis on whole grains and legumes, the minimal waste, the seasonal adaptation, the integration of wild and cultivated foods, and the sophisticated preservation techniques all offer insights relevant to modern food security challenges. While we needn't return to medieval conditions, we might benefit from recovering some of the ecological wisdom embedded in these historical practices. The humble meals that kept medieval peasants alive, the daily bread, the simmering pottage, the carefully preserved vegetables, the occasional egg or bit of cheese, deserve recognition not as mere survival food, but as the product of generations of accumulated knowledge and adaptation. In these simple but effective foods, we can recognize the ingenuity and resilience of ordinary people who, despite significant constraints, developed a dietary system that sustained life through centuries of challenge and change. So next time you bite into a slice of whole grain bread or stir a pot of lentil stew, take a moment to remember the legacy behind those simple foods. The medieval peasant diet wasn't just about surviving, it was about adapting, preserving, and thriving within nature's limits. If this deep dive into historical diets gave you a new perspective, let us know in the comments. What surprised you the most? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss more stories from the past that just might reshape your future. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the wisest ways forward come from looking back.